Okay, so good morning. Can you hear me at the back? Okay, right. Okay, so I will be talking about entity classification for a secure network digital earth. And this is joint work with my PhD student. He graduated last year, Saber. Okay, so network digital earth, this is this nice concept that Orup has been pushing, and my understanding of it is that basically we want to collect information on a global scale, we want to connect it with physical places, and the information represents is information both about man-made structures and natural processes. And then we are analyzing this using tools of network science. Namely, we have some network representations and we analyze those. That's, and yesterday's talks, the talks you attended, many of them are largely in this context. What I'm going to look at now is network digital earth, but from the standpoint of security. And when people say security, typically they mean the traditional question of how do I tell if my computer is infected, how do I prevent my computer from getting infected, and so on, security for cyber security. I will sort of flip the question, and I will be looking at if we know the infections on some computers, what can we say about the computers themselves, or about the entities to which those computers belong, the companies that own those computers. Okay, so I won't be looking at it as trying to prevent the malware or trying to prevent infection or detecting or diagnosing and prevention and cure. I'll be looking more at what does the infection tell us about the patient. Okay, so that's the kind of question I'm going to be answering today, and I think this is in line with this network digital earth for the following reason, because we want to understand things about the world, and when we connect everything together, we will be getting a lot of information, and there will be parts of the world we can't access. So for example, there are lots of entities behind the Great Firewall of China, and you can't go to those companies and see their computers and so on, but nevertheless those computers, some of them get infected and they send infected packets out that come out from the firewall of China, and so from outside you can say what kinds of infections are there inside of China, even though you can't go into China yourself. Okay, I mean through the network. So this is relevant because there will be parts of the digital network earth we won't have access to, but we would still like to draw inferences about them. Okay, so for those of you who are in security, this should all be fairly, the next few slides should be standard stuff, but for those of you who don't know what a botnet is, I'll just briefly describe it, and we will be talking about botnets mostly. So a bot is an infected computer, a botnet is a collection of infected computers. So if your computer just gets infected with a worm or virus or something, that's a standalone thing. But if a bunch of computers that are all infected with viruses, they all act together as a single distributed system, then we call that a botnet. And botnets, they provide a cloud computing platform for a variety of criminal acts, and I'll list some of them in the subsequent slides. And the reason people use botnets is because they give you a lot of reach, so you can do a lot of damage. With a single computer you can only do so much damage. With lots of computers you can launch denial of service attacks, you can send lots of spam email, you can do Bitcoin mining, you can do lots of things. And also because of this collection of networks, the software you use all kinds of ways of, even though you are controlling the network, you distance yourself from it. So you log into your botnet through a variety of other computers, you disguise your trail, so it's very hard to find out who's the actual mastermind behind these networks. And these networks are also available, people sell them on eBay. So you can rent them. So people compromise a bunch of computers and then they sell them. There are like Silk Road and dark, the parts of the dark internet where you can actually go and buy it, but also on the regular white internet you can buy it if you know the code words and so on. People will sell it as though it's something else, but people who are in the know will know what is actually being sold, and you can buy or rent these botnets. So there's lots of work on this. If you look on the internet, you'll see lots about that. So this is a basic botnet structure. Is there a laser on this? Okay, so this guy is the mastermind, and he or she controls through a server. It's typically people these days, earlier botnets used to have like a single server that you would control, and maybe he'll connect using a Tor network or something. But today people actually have a P2P system, so the control of the botnet is distributed amongst the botnet itself, so that you avoid any kind of decapitation attacks against the botnet. They use covert channels, so all his communication will be very low bandwidth, so people won't suddenly see that their firewall is having a lot of traffic. They use strong cryptography, so they'll use all public key cryptography, so it's very hard to break it. So you can't, by listening on the traffic, you can't figure out how the command and control is happening. And people install all these antivirus software, Symantec and Norton and so on, and most of them go off of some kind of signature. They look for in the file, they look for some particular signatures, and they find it, then they quarantine that piece of code. So almost all the botnets for the last at least 15-16 years, they've all used this thing called polymorphism, where they keep changing their code base. So they factor it in different ways, and they obfuscate it and move things around so that signature based schemes fail. So ultimately you have to rely on behavior. Like if it is doing bad things, then it's a malware, but otherwise it's kind of hard to tell if it's malware or not. Okay. So that's the basic botnet structure. So like we said, botnets are responsible for data theft, massive spams, DDoS attacks, stealing identities. You get somebody's password, you can take money out of their bank account. This is a 2015 thing in the Wall Street Journal that said how much money is being lost. It said something like financial service sector is losing I don't know, it's like 28.3 million and so on, but this doesn't sound right to me. It's million seems kind of low. So anyway, this is the I was googling, and this is the thing that I could find. It's very hard to tell these estimates. People say, you know, this is millions of dollars or billions. I think the order of magnitude here should be billions, at least. But anyway, they cause a lot of damage. So these botnets have been known to take down like Amazon.com for seconds to minutes at a time. And Amazon.com, we know it makes, the revenues are over $200 billion a year. So even if you take down for a few seconds, they've lost millions of dollars. Okay, so botnets do a lot of damage, and what we are going to spend most of the talk is trying to figure out some properties of the entity. So I will explain how we can infer things about the entity, and ideally we'd like to know exactly which entity it is. So if we can see some bad traffic on the internet, and we can say, oh, this is happening because IIT KGP computers at IIT KGP have been compromised or something, that would be ideal. But the signal that we get is very weak. There's not that much information. So we are going to make more general inferences. We'll infer the sector that an entity belongs to. We'll say something like, this traffic that we are seeing is from a computer or collection of computers inside an educational institution. Okay, and so that's in the educational sector, and that's the best we are going to be able to do, that kind of stuff. And so obviously that is a first step. Like I said, entities behind firewalls like the Great Firewall of China, things like this, you can infer. So even though they register their IP addresses and they register their companies, many of them are opaque. It's in Chinese, they have lots of shell companies, so you can't tell what the entity is. But by looking at what kinds of botnets have infected it, you can say roughly what kind of entity it is. And so it's very useful. Also, if we see certain, obviously these botnets attack certain types of entities more. It doesn't make much sense to attack your personal computer because you don't have that much money. But if you attack Amazon, or if you attack a bank, JP Morgan or something, you can make more money. So certain entities are better targets for these kinds of criminals. And so if we know which entity sectors are being attacked, we can adopt more scalable practices to secure them. Okay, so just to give you two examples. So this has been going on for nearly 25 years. There was a very famous worm called the slammer worm. It took down the entire almost the entire internet, SQL Slammer on the night of 25th Jan 2003, started sometime in the night. They think it started somewhere in Singapore. That whole night, the computer, I used to work at this company called Akamai, so I was following this. The whole night, the internet was basically not usable. You could sometimes connect to some local servers, but if you tried to connect most websites, they were unreachable. You couldn't send email, you couldn't do anything. Then people went and they used BGP, they quarantined portions of the internet, they put some patches, they fixed it. So by next morning, the internet had come back. It had been limping along. Recently, there was this thing called Mirai. Actually, a student at Rutgers University called Paras Jha, he built this software, and he was he took down on 21st October 2016. He took down this DNS provider called DYN. Do people know? People here use DYN? No. So basically, when you have an ISP or something like this, you get you want to set up a domain name. Then ISP has like changing IP addresses. If you sign up with somebody like DYN, they'll give you like a permanent IP address for your thing. So lots of people register with DYN, and so if you take down DYN, then lots of people, you can't access their particular their DNS servers are down. Then you can't access their websites. So if you attack a DNS provider, you can take down access, because nobody uses IP addresses to access a website, right? You use a name to access a website. Okay, and then this guy also, he basically made it so that off-campus access for Rutgers University from 2014 to 2016 was broken. So people, professors and all were complaining they couldn't go off somewhere else and VPN in, because those servers were continuously under DDoS attack by this Mirai software. And then in 2016, the FBI found this guy and they arrested him. And anyway, it cost a lot of money. Apparently, Rutgers spent millions of dollars to try to figure out what was going on and how to fix it and so on. Here is some collection of botnet families. So just to quickly tell you, so this whole botnet space is very confused. So there is not like a single nomenclature system or anything. So there's a bunch of private entities like companies, security companies that analyze the various pieces of malware, and then they publish saying, oh, we detected this malware in the wild and we are giving it this name, and then the same thing will get named by some other company. Then there are some quasi private institutions like CERT at CMU and so on. They will also jump in. So the same piece of software will get different names, and this, also from the same code base, these guys, these bad guys, will create many different variants. So when you say this particular botnet, you sometimes not even clear which botnet you're talking about, because there's like a million variants and there's different names for it. So just to give you a sense, these are some famous botnet families, and they'll have multiple names. So you'll see something like BRFCK is the same as Dynamer, is the same as Gen Backdoor. Yeah, so even figuring out what is a botnet, isolating that particular strain, it's kind of complicated. Okay, so what we, where we got the idea for this project was, so in biology, you have this thing called the microbiome, and the microbiome is all the DNA of organisms that are living on you. So you may not know it, but you have, I think, more than like 1 million times DNA, as much DNA outside and inside your body that doesn't belong to your core DNA as your own DNA. Okay, so there's a ton of organisms living on you. So actually, before we came here on Tuesday, we went to Calcutta to Science City and Salt Lake City, that museum, and they had Science Museum, and they had this set of posters, and they were showing pictures at finer and finer scales, and they were showing the head of a pin. And even on the head of the pin, there was like, it was crawling with bacteria and viruses. And there are, inside bacteria, there are viruses attacking the bacteria and so on. So life kind of goes to very small scale, and life is everywhere. So we like to think we are in control of ourselves and our DNA is our identity. That's not true at all. We are influenced by lots of other external DNA, and the physical world we perceive and the physical world we experience is a product of all of this. So now people have said, okay, we can actually identify people by their microbiome. So different people have different signatures. So you can just take, and this, there have been papers in Nature and Science now for the last 7-8 years, where you can just take a swab of somebody's elbow, and you can look at the inside of the elbow or the back of the knee, places where you sweat. You can collect the DNA from there, and then that will be pretty unique to that person. Because that's the kind of microbial organisms you're harboring. And so we're trying to do the same thing. We saying that we look at an entity like IIT Kharagpur, we'll look at all the computers inside it, and we'll see what all infections they harbor, what all botnets they harbor, and from that can we create a signature for IIT Kharagpur. Like this is the kinds of botnets they harbor. And as you can tell, this is a moving signature, right? Because people will patch computers, they will fix it, new infections will come, it will be a rolling thing. Okay, so so the way you do this data collection, so how do you find what infections are infecting a computer? So they do it by this thing called sinkholing. And what happens is that this software, this malware, will be probing various computers on the internet, and when it finds some vulnerable computer, it has running an IIS server, a SQL server, somebody has forgotten to patch their some software they're running on their firewall, something they're running, then it will enter, and once it's there, then it will typically connect back to some DNS name, and then wait for instructions from there. It will ask for instructions. So what should I do now? And then it will connect up with the other bad computers, and they'll all do something together. So what these guys do, typically they'll put in lots of DNS names inside of that software, and so all these security companies, but they won't register all of them. And sometimes, the guy writes the software, he forgets to register the DNS name, or he doesn't want to pay for the DNS registration, or it's a backup name. So there are lots of reasons why some of those names go unregistered. And so what these security companies do, many of them, they will, when it's trying to contact the DNS address, they will go ahead and register that DNS name in their own under themselves, and so when this machine contacts the DNS servers for the resolution, they'll give back an IP address of their own machine. So then this infected machine will contact them, so they know this is an infected machine that's contacting me. So that's how you can get various infected computers around the world to contact you. It's not a perfect system. Some of the DNS things may already be registered. Sometimes you can't reverse engineer the code and look at what DNS systems it's using, but they work with DNS providers, the big DNS providers like VeriSign and so on, and they try to find out as many infected computers as possible. There's a bunch of security companies doing this. So that's how they collect the information. So they know, okay, this computer is infected, and it's sending me packets belonging to Sality or some thing like this. Okay, so what we worked with was this. So I'm halfway through, is that right? Okay. Okay. So what we worked with is this data set called Aardvark. It's made by this company called BitSight. BitSight is one of the leaders in this space. They purchased this company called Anubis Networks. Anubis is fairly well known in the space. They've set up this infrastructure, the sinkholing infrastructure for collecting all these data, and so a year or 2 years ago, BitSight bought Anubis. So most of this data set actually belongs to Anubis, and so I knew somebody who works there, and they wanted to see if we can extract something useful from their data, and so they gave us this data set. So basically, so they anonymized it because they're a private company. They don't want us to know anything that could hurt them or other people. They don't want any bad publicity. In fact, when we published this paper, they didn't want to be co-authors on the paper because they're in the business of making money, and some thing comes out like this, and if it says something bad about Anubis, they don't want to have to deal with it. So many companies don't want to deal with publication and so on. So they have their own nomenclature system. So they gave us these records. They tell us what botnet was there. They look at these companies. So when they get they see this infection coming from this IP address, they look up the IP address in a registry like Rai, Perrin, Apnic, things like this, and then they'll say, oh, this block is registered under IIT Kharagpur, so this computer belongs to IIT Kharagpur. And so they have these entities, and then there are databases of companies like Hoover's and so on, Bloomberg, all of these guys have databases of companies, so you can look at that IP, you can look at the company name, it's registered, you can find out what sector it belongs to, and then you can also get a sense for what size, how many employees does that company have. So they gave us records for 400 days, so there were a total of about 78 million records. So each record is on a day, they see how many computers from that particular company contacted them with that particular botnet infection, and they aggregate it. So on October 15th, 2016, there were 23 contacts from an IP address belonging to IIT Kharagpur that contacted them. So they know this many infection cases are there inside IIT Kharagpur. Okay, so we got this data set. At any time, if you have any questions, you can stop me and ask. So these are the sectors that they use. These are the 23 sectors: aerospace, defense, so on. So all companies are split into these 23 sectors, and you can see there's a sector called unknown. And then sizes, they split the sizes into the following 5 categories: up to 100, 0 to 100 employees or computers, 100 to 1,000. 1,000 to 10,000 and so on, 50,000 plus, and then there's also an unknown category. So using both offline and online information, they make these estimates, and they gave all this data to us. So first thing we looked at, so this data is terribly noisy. As you can imagine, there's no consensus on naming botnets. The companies will go out of business, new companies will come, IP addresses will be moved around. What is an infection, what is not an infection is not even clear. So it's a very confused kind of world out there. When we looked at it, we found that most of the infections belong to entities in the technology sector. And that makes sense because technology from 0 to 100 was the most common collection of infections. And the reason is small companies, they have computers, they're trying various things. They sometimes don't have money to pay for good sysadmins and so on. They get infected, and they are the sources of lots of infection. Because tech companies have computers. Telecommunications, same as ISPs. Lots of people sign up with an ISP, and behind the ISP's IP block. So the ISP owns the IP block, but from behind there, they're sending out lots of infections. Education. So students are constantly, leaving their computers unprotected. They don't have the money to pay for antivirus software. It gets compromised. They don't even know about it. So educational institutions are very high, and tourism, hospitality is also very high. People go to hotels and so on. They connect, and then they try to do bad things because if you're doing it from a hotel, then you think you won't get caught because you can leave and go somewhere else and do it again. So people access, sites with child pornography or send spam email from various public locations like Starbucks and things like this. Okay, so we removed all of those kinds of filtered out all those kinds of things, and we also, lots of companies sort of double counted because they have subsidiaries, because as you can tell, companies are complex entities with substructures and so on. And so we filtered a bunch of the data, we cleaned it up, and from like 78 million, we're down to about 4 million. And this is what a record looks like. Basically, on a particular day, we count how many events came, how many contacts were made by computers from that entity. And we got it all the data we got from this company was anonymized, so we can't really tell what is the IP address, what is actually going on. Okay, so I'll just give you a quick glance of the data, and then I'll show you our contribution. So if you look sector wise, you can see here that this is that font is too small, so sorry about that, even I can't read it. But technology has the most number of entities, and this is some other entities. I think this is education, so there are lots of education companies and so on. So this is just a distribution of entities by sector. This is by size. As you can tell, if you look at the various entities, 100 to 1,000, this is the most common size of a company. It's a bell-shaped curve. There are few very small companies and few very large companies, as you can kind of imagine. If you look at the number of sectors of botnet family attacks, this is now actually something interesting. So this is saying if I look at a botnet family, this is the number of botnets that are attacking one sector. This is the number of botnets that are attacking 2 sectors. This is the number of botnets attacking all 23 sectors. So this is some kind of a bimodal distribution. It says that many of the software are written to target only a couple sectors. So a few sectors, and some of the software is written to target indiscriminately, attack every sector. But people, either they are like specialists, they write specialist malware to attack certain types of companies, or they write general software to just randomly attack everybody. Okay, so that seems to be roughly the kinds of software people are malware people are writing. Also, if you look at attacks per capita, if you divide by the size of the company, the number of employees, we find that small companies have the highest number of per capita attacks, large companies have the fewest. So this makes sense. If you are in a large company, you have economies of scale, you can hire sysadmins and you can hire people to manage your software and fix it and so on. So you're much more safe. So you're much more safe working for a big company than you are working for a small company, because a small company you have to do it yourself. It's just like the difference between flying your own private jet versus flying commercial. Commercial is much safer than flying a private jet, right? Because commercial airlines, the per capita accident rate is much lower than if you're flying your own small plane. Small planes go down all the time. So these are sort of natural things. Okay, so what did we find? We found, so the data is very noisy, and but we managed to find some sort of, we were sort of mining the data for something. We found that we could observe a power law for the infection lifetime distribution. So we have to isolate what it means for an infection, and even trying to figure out what is if you have various events, how do you connect them together in a thread and say this is one infection, right? So even that is a hard thing, but if you can do that, then we found that that actually has a power law distribution, and then we came up with a generative model that explains why you should have a power law. Then our original goal was that we would actually, given the infections, we will actually be able to, if we just from looking at the infections, we can say, oh, this is an educational institution, or with between 100 and 1,000 employees, or something like this. So first we really wanted to identify the thing itself, and then we found the signal data is too noisy, we can't do that. Then we wanted to try to identify, can we trial the sector and size? And what we found was trying to actually look at these power laws and the parameters from these power laws, we were not able to make it work. But if we threw this neural network at it, and this is this black box, and today everybody is doing this game where they take some data and then just throw it at a neural network and see what it does. It's somehow, we don't know what it's learning, but it seems to be doing better. So we can predict the sector and the size just from looking at the attack traffic. We can do it about 5 times and 2 times better, 5 times for sector and 2 times than random. And any kind of handcrafted system we did to figure it out didn't even come close. So there is some signal in there, and the neural network is able to extract it. Okay, so so this botnet theory, let me just describe this. So here what we are plotting is log of the length of the infection. So this is log L, this log n. So on this axis is log of n, and this axis, this vertical axis, is log of the probability the duration is greater than n. So if we plot that, that's this blue line, and this particular botnet is a botnet called Sality. So the definition we used for what is an infection is a collection of events involving the same botnet family operating from the same IP address without with no more than a 3-day gap. So if there's a 3-day gap where there's no contact from those IP addresses, then we say that maybe that infection got patched or fixed, and then it's a new infection starting from that point on. Okay, so that's how we define an infection, and then we plotted the log of the infection duration, the log of the probability, meaning the frequency, number of infection which had that lifetime, versus log of the infection lifetime versus log of n, the duration. And we found this kind of a graph which sort of is somewhat linear if you fit a straight line to it, and looked like a power law. And so now the question is, why? So first, that data that that graph that I showed you doesn't happen universally for all botnets. Only for some out of the 200 botnet families, it came for about 20 botnet, so a tenth. The rest of the data is all kind of, the graph is all weird and thing. So I've sort of cherry picked one of the better ones and shown you that graph. But it's still interesting that some botnets seem to have this power law, because if you look at human infections, it's very much a bell-shaped curve. So suppose you get measles, and measles takes 21 days to recover. If you look at the duration of measles infection across various humans, some people may recover in 17 days, some people may recover in 23 days, but it will be very concentrated around 21. It will drop off very sharply around 21. You won't find a heavy tail. You won't find some people have measles even after 300 days. That just doesn't happen. We either get cured or we die. Whereas these cyber infections, they seem to show this power law distribution. They have this heavy tail, because people are not patching it, so it just lives and lives in your computer for a long time. And so we came up with this very simple model, and it's a bit of an art coming up with a power law explanation for power law. We had two parameters. One we called W, the window, and P, the probability. So the window is the period of time with which the botnet is contacting the sinkhole. So if the botnet is contacting every W days, then it sort of is creating a detectable event. Maybe it could also be the period of time with which you are running some anti-malware software. So if you are running some scanning software every W days, then you will eradicate it every W days. So that's one parameter we defined. Another parameter is P, is the probability of detecting the infection. So if you first have to detect that your computer is infected, and then maybe you'll do something about it. And the interesting thing is, just from these two parameters, we are able to generate a power law. And the key idea is that if your computer has not been fixed for a long time, it's conditional on the fact that your computer has been infected for K days. That means that you're not paying attention to your computer. Then it's more likely the infection is going to continue, because if you haven't fixed it, or maybe you don't know how to fix it, or maybe it's expensive, or maybe the people who have to write the patch have not written the patch, right? All of these things happen. So then, conditional on that, you're likely to continue to be infected, so the chance of you fixing the infection drops. And if we sort of adopt this kind of a dropping rate of, after K windows, P reduces to P over K plus 1, which is this periodically reducing, then we can see that this actually gives rise to a power law. So I have just sort of given you the gist of the argument here. The probability that the infection lasts for more than n days is basically P is the probability of detection. So for the first W days, you don't detect it. 1 minus P times 1 minus P W. Then after W days, we say, because you have not been cleaned for W days, that means that the probability of being cleaned over the next W days falls from P to P over 2. So then now again you don't get detected 1 minus P over 2, 1 minus P over 2 W times. Then now you've gone through 2 W periods, days without detection. Then the probability of detection falls from P to P over 3. And so if you adopt this kind of a model, then you see that it actually generates a power law. The log of P is proportional, linearly related to log of n. Okay, and we haven't found this particular model in the literature, like preferential attachment that generates a power law. If you look at some activities like the time delay you have in responding to email, that also follows a power law. But the generative models, the stories for saying why those power laws happen, those stories all seem different. So this seems like a new kind of story that I have not seen in the literature. Does this mean that this story is the right explanation for why we see the power law? But it's one story that may explain why the power law is occurring. You actually have to do a more fine-grained analysis and show some causal links. But anyway, in the spirit of the pseudoscience that happens in network science, this is as good a story as any. Okay. So then we do the usual statistics. We calculate what the P values are, W values are, what the R square is, and we get pretty good fit. And we can see 0 axis 1, sality. We can do sector wise, we can do specific entity wise, and we consistently get various P and W. Like I said, this happens for about 30-40 of the botnets, so but not all of them. And then we wanted to infer the sector and size. And so for that, we tried two techniques. We used decision trees and neural networks. So how many people here know neural networks? Everybody? Okay, good. So this is now like court. Everybody.
Nila is putting half hands.
Yeah, Nila is putting half a hand. Okay. The thing is, nobody understands what neural networks are. It's just a black box. There's hardly any theory to explain why they work, what they do. So talking about pseudoscience, that's like height of pseudoscience. But it works. So anyway, everybody's publishing, and this game will go on for a while. So again, this is we just use the standard feed-forward network. There's lots of people use convolutional, LSTM, pooling. There's a whole bunch of jargon attached to it, and you can do whatever you want. Anything goes in this world. These are some details of the neural network we used. Cross entropy is the loss function. It's a bunch of jargon. Don't worry about it. So the results. This is the red is the baseline for. So we have about 20 sectors. So if you want to predict the sector randomly, and if you sample correctly so that you uniformize the distribution across all the sectors, then the chance of picking the right sector by random is 1 in 20, or about 5%. Okay, so that's what the phi is indicating. If you use random forests, in case you don't care, are basically an ensemble of decision trees where you do this sort of bagging by feature. I don't know if you know about bagging or bootstrap aggregating. If you don't know the jargon, don't worry about it. It's just basically some classifier uses a collection of random trees, and that gets us about 18%, and this neural network is getting us about 25%, so 5 times. And if this sector star is, if we feed in all the traffic data and we feed the size also in, then it actually improves slightly. So even though I've rounded it to 25, it improves it slightly. For size, we can do about a factor of 20. So if you give me all the attack traffic and ask me what is the size of the company, then I can bin it in one of those 6 buckets about 2 times. So sector we can do 5 times, which is pretty impressive. Size is a more noisy thing. The reason size is more noisy is because if you look at companies like Intel, they'll have like one IP address, but from behind it they'll have lots of traffic coming out. So you can't really draw conclusions from how much infection there is, and very noisy. Some small companies follow good hygiene practices, some big companies, and so they look like big companies. So it's very hard to tell big companies apart from small companies. They'll have the same IP footprint and the same traffic footprint because the small guy because he doesn't have so many infections, big guy because they clean up all the infections. Okay, so I'm close to the end. This is some prediction accuracy heat map. Basically, you want to see that it's along the diagonal is where these are the right predictions, and we have some prediction capability. Then we looked at what exactly is so whenever this neural network works, you want to try to understand why is it working, where is the signal, which botnet attack is telling me about the sector. And we found that, for example, some botnets carry more signal than the other. So there's this whole thing about attribution for neural networks. There's this whole way of doing it. And so we just use that technology. And we find that botnets like add aware, push do, cut whale, and so on, they give you a lot more signal. So by looking at the traffic of those botnets, you can tell much more. You can discriminate between consumer goods and finance, those 2 sector categories much better. So there is, if you actually go into the neural network, you can try to extract some meaningful information. So like I said, I'm close to the end. We used the data set is very noisy and incomplete. We are only capturing a fraction of the communications, because who knows that botnet, if it's coming out and reaching, and then we have registered the domain name, we are seeing the traffic, but maybe it's using some other domain name and going somewhere else, so we don't even know about those infections, right? So you're learning only about a fraction of the infections. You're also misclassifying it. Like I said, there's no easy way to classify, there's no consensus, it's a sort of a random industry. The things that we are doing, the black box nature of our deep nets, these deep nets, they do some prediction, but exactly how they're doing it, why they're doing it, we don't have an understanding, which is not good. And then we came up with this generative model, which is sort of, I would say, the only intellectual contribution here at some level. We also found several instances where the model did not fit. So you actually probably need a richer model. So I just wanted to say, so I wanted to thank BitSight for the data set. I want to thank you all for listening to me. And I am, as a conference organizer, one thing I just wanted to say was thank you to Niloy and Arup. So if you ever get a chance to do a conference with these guys, do it, because there's no work at all, and you'll also get some credit for it. So Niloy did 90% of the work, organizing this, getting you all, making things run so smoothly, and of course I'm sure he has a huge team of people helping him, and Arup came up with the concept and all that. So thanks to them, and also thanks to everybody who traveled from far away to come and attend this workshop. So thank you for that.
Thank our speaker, Professor Sundaram. So we can take a few questions.
Yeah.
So sorry, I came a bit late.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
So about this deep nets thing.
Yeah.
So what when does imports?
For each, so we have about 200 botnets. For each botnet, it's a time series of 400 days. How many times that botnet contacted us from that entity? So you pick some entity. So you like some block of some IP address belonging to one company. You feed it 200 time series, each time series of length 400, and then it come back and tell you this is the input, and the output is, does it that IP address, does it belong to education sector, or does it belong to consumer goods or something?
So what kind of model are you using, like LSTMs or?
Just the straight of forward. No, that's the simplest variant.
You wrote deep, that's why.
Deep as in we had 3 layers. But you have to use the word deep on all neural networks today. So.
Because all these deep networks tend to work well when you have larger data, larger volumes of data.
Correct. So our data.
That's why I was asking this question. So you feel that your input is large enough to actually train a deep network well?
So what does it mean to train a network well? You have some data.
You have a better classification accuracy.
Correct. Yeah, so we did it with random forests, and then we did it with deep nets. So it's 400 times 200. That's like 80,000 data points is one input.
I was just wondering if one uses models like CNN, etc.
Yeah.
Fit for this kind of tasks. So CNN actually allows you to feed this kind of features.
Right.
Would it really
Improve? Could. So this is there's this thing called graduate descent, or what people call this thing called gradient descent, stochastic gradient. But the joke is everybody calls it graduate descent, because you take a graduate student and then you make him descend into lower and lower levels of hell, with trying different things. At some point he graduates and leaves, and then he doesn't want to touch your neural network anymore. So that's the most I could get Saber to do. So.
So I have a very nice question here. So
yeah.
You have a result on size, right? So
yeah.
So what exactly the result that you have on size and predicting the size of the?
Right. So size, we had this bucket 5 categories, some 0 to 100 employees, 100 to 1000 something. So if you give the time series and you ask us what is the size of that particular company, then if you just we had like 6 buckets or 5 buckets of size. If you did randomly, you picked one of those, after waiting for the sort of the a priori distribution. If you uniformize it, then if it's 5, then you should be correct 20% of the time. If you just ask me what size of this is this, if you just randomly flip a coin and say it should be 20%, using this deep net we can get 40% accuracy.
But your initial hypothesis was that so the larger companies should have like a more secure infrastructure than the smaller one, right? So with that hypothesis, how do you explain this result?
Yeah. So so that is not a hypothesis. That is actually a fact. If you look, you see that the bigger companies are safer than the smaller companies. The reason is because you can't distinguish between big and small companies, because big companies also have a very small IP foot. The features that we are putting in are basically the traffic, and then we also can tell like how many IP addresses belong to that entity. Big companies will have sometimes very small IP blocks that are visible to the external world. So they will all come out through one firewall or through few firewalls. For economy of scale, all the employees VPN into that company, and it comes out only through a small block. Secondly, small companies, they don't show that high infection rate because they don't have that many computers. They're not running that much different software, so they have like few infections. Big companies, because they're cleaning up and they have good hygiene, and they also have few infections. So then we are not able to tell big and small companies. That's why we are only getting factor 2.
And the major feature is like traffic patterns. Right?
Just the traffic pattern.
You have sectors, so depending on different sectors, do you have any information about or any observation regarding the change in traffic pattern for all this botnet traffic?
So there are some, it's a good question. So some observations you can make. I made one observation that technology, tourism, hospitality, education, these are the bad sectors where there's a lot of very high infection because the people follow very bad hygiene, and students, people who go to hotels, they're behind the firewall. That people who are traveling, they want to try going to risky places. They would not do it from their own homes, things like this. And then we do notice that in certain sectors, if you looked at the distribution, finance is much more vulnerable. I forget some other sectors, the people are not so tech savvy, like consumer goods and things like this. So there is, you could do finer grained analysis. Our feeling was at some point we were just, we had just only 400 days of data. We were sort of torturing the data quite a bit, so we stopped at some point. Yeah, but you're right. You could do a finer analysis.
Yeah. So, any other questions? So let's thank Professor Sundaram. So we can facilitate Professor Sundaram with a small.
Okay.